Kia ora te whānau a iho karaiti, ko Andrew Doubleday aho. Today we're looking at the Gospel for Sunday the 11th of February 2024. And it's Mark chapter 9 verses 2 to 9. It's Mark's account of the Transfiguration. So we pick the narrative up in Mark chapter 9 verse 2. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. I was an anxious young man. I struggled to make the transition from a teenager into adulthood. Anxiety was something that I was very familiar with, and it's something that in many ways dogged a large part of my life, but certainly right through my 20s. And it wouldn't take much to tip me over into a highly anxious state. I would just have to see something on television that would upset me, or hear something that somebody said, and I could be in a state of anxiety for 2 or 3 days. Now, this wasn't obvious to other people. We're talking about my internal reality. And it was a period of my life where I rarely experienced peace, any kind of depth of peace. For me, that peace of Christ which passes understanding was at best a very momentary and fleeting thing. I could think of a couple of occasions where, being at a prayer meeting, deeply focused with a group of others on the sacrificial love of Jesus, and I experienced the way that Charles Haddon Spurgeon, that great Baptist preacher, described it. I looked to Jesus and the dove of peace came. But he goes on to say, I looked at the dove and it flew away. And that was certainly my experience. So they were rare and fleeting moments of relief and a great sea of deep internal unhappiness and uncertainty. There came a point, though, when I was challenged about the call to ministry, and I realized that in one way or another this had been gnawing away at me for years and I'd been avoiding it. And the point came where I said yes, yes, yes to God, yes to the possibility of training, yes to offering myself to the church. And at that point, something totally unexpected and remarkable, and for me miraculous, happened. I was filled from that moment with a deep and profound sense of peace like I had never experienced. Those words that Paul talks about, that peace of Christ, it just so filled me, that passes understanding, that passes description. And it rested upon me for 3 full weeks. 3 weeks. It was there, it was ubiquitous, it was present the whole time. And it didn't matter what I saw on television. It didn't matter what I heard. It didn't matter what things that at some other time would have upset me and set me off. Nothing. Absolutely nothing for that full 3 weeks was able to shake this profound sense of being cocooned in this place of loving peace. And after 3 weeks, it just quietly dissipated. And I went back to being normal, anxious Andrew. But with a clear sense of knowing what had happened and knowing a sense of a validation of God's call on my life. It actually makes sense when you look at it from a New Testament frame, where Paul in Colossians talks about letting the peace of Christ, and it's literally be the umpire. That when you're facing big decisions and you're struggling to know how you need to move forward, for me, when I'm facing those decisions, I'll wear the alternatives like an overcoat. And sometimes the most difficult ones are yet the ones that bring with them a sense of peace. Knowing that this is going to be hard, knowing that this is going to be challenging, but also having a deep sense that the Spirit of Christ is calling me into this is saying yes. And so this experience was part of mine. And I'm able to look back at that, all those years ago, decades ago, and they act like a marker post. It acts like a marker post in my life. I've had others, but none as profound and as significant as that one. And it's something I'm able to look back to in times of uncertainty and in doubt. And able to draw strength from, knowing that that was real, knowing that God was profoundly at work and the God who called me was still at work in my life today. In the text we have before us the story of the Transfiguration. I want to suggest we have another marker post. This whole experience was a marker post for all those who were involved, well, particularly the 4, Jesus and the 3 disciples, the executive of his team of 12. But where did this happen? Well, of course, the scholars will tell you various possibilities. My quiet and settled conviction is that it happened on Mount Hermon. Now, Mount Hermon is in the far north of Israel. It's up on the Syrian border. It's up towards Lebanon. It's right at the extreme north. It may even be in Lebanon. And it is commanding. It is a huge, it's not steep so much as massive. And it has a commanding view both of south, looking out over the whole of Israel, and north. I've sometimes wondered as I've reflected on this, that this was a turning point as well for Jesus. This was a hinge point. Because as he goes up the mountain with the 3, he could have kept going. He could have just kept going. This is the furthermost north that we are aware that he travelled. And here he turns round to come back at him. Now, why do I say Mount Hermon? Well, the last locator, and it's true of the other Gospels that have this experience, the last locator we have for Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is up towards the Syrian border. Caesarea Philippi is further in and further up from Bethsaida, which is round the top of the lake. And this is where he's been ministry. It's already on the lower slopes of the Hermon Range, and it's just a case of him going further and further up with the three. Makes sense to me. As I said, from the top, he has a view of the Holy Land stretched out before him. I'm not sure, I think he might even be able to see Jerusalem way down there. And there's a sense that as he stands there and looks, as he's engaged in this experience with Moses and Elijah, as he's heard the voice, as they've all heard the voice, he's got this choice. Does he keep going? Does he walk away from what he's called to? Or does he know that this is the point where he heads back to where God's called him? And he knows what's ahead of him. He knows the grim suffering that's ahead of him. And so from this top, he's able to look as he faces the end of his ministry and his earthly life. And it's from here, it's from this experience, it's from this moment, it's from this turning point that Jesus actually starts the walk toward the cross. Every step on his last journey to Jerusalem, because from then on he winds his way, every step takes him to Jerusalem and inexorably closer to the end. It's all downhill all the way to Jerusalem. It's interesting that Zion is always seen as going up, even though it's going down to it. It's up because of its importance. So it's all the way is downhill. And you think, well, so why is this thing on the mountain important? Why is it so important? Well, we know that what the three of them, Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, discussed was how he was going to fulfill his life's call with what was ahead of him, his suffering and his death. It was all about that. And this is strength for the journey. This experience on the mountain for Jesus is a marker post. It's there to sustain him through what's ahead, through his walking all the way into Jerusalem, through his arrest, through his trial, through his execution and eventual death. Those hours spent on the cross. A source of strength in the days ahead, that he knows that he's part of something much bigger. Knows that what ahead is going to be difficult, but ultimately God's purposes are being worked out through this. That it's going to be okay, and more than going to be okay, it's all going to be worth it. Because he's bringing many sons and daughters with him into life as a result of this. He's demonstrating once and for all to the whole of humanity the depths of God's love for us. How much does he love us? That much. And so this is something I suspect that even in the garden, even through those hours of being before the Sanhedrin, being before Herod, being before the chief priest, being before Pilate, there's always an awareness of what had happened some weeks or perhaps months earlier on, way up there on the Mount of Transfiguration. And that it's all being worked out step by step. And that ultimately, as uncomfortable and as awkward and as difficult and as horrendous and as gnarly as this is, it's all going to be okay. But what about the three? Why were they there? Well, the first thing that's probably important to notice is that if they hadn't been there, that nobody would have written this down. There needed to be witnesses. There needed to be, and there were three people who were with Jesus who were just totally gobsmacked when they saw what happened, frightened out of their wits. They had no doubt about who the three were that they were seeing there, and Jesus absolutely transformed in front of them. They saw him in a glory that they had never imagined possible. They recognized, oh, there's more to this rabbi than we had ever imagined. And they saw not only him for who he was, but for the company that he kept. Moses and Elijah? Seriously? Could you get two more important figures out of Israel's history? And so here they are. And they're witnesses to this profound event. So that's the first thing. They need witnesses. But the next thing is that it's also a source of strength for them. A source of encouragement. Most of the disciples met with fairly unpleasant ends. Decades later, in his second epistle, Peter writes, "We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty." We were there, he said, we were there. For he received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain. And we can see how decades later the memory of it continues to remain strong, continues to fill Peter with a sense of excitement and joy and confidence and peace, continues to be a source of inspiration and validation for him and the others, that what that they are currently engaged in is real, that their ministry is important. It has eternal significance. Friends, I just want to encourage you to recognize that although these are stories of other people, their story, my encouragement to you is to look for your own places where there have been marker posts in your life. And they may be relatively small things, things that seem so coincidental yet insignificant, but signs of validation and of peace, signs of awareness of God's presence, of God's activity, of God's working in your life, and continue to draw on them as sources of strength, of grace, and of hope for the future. Amen.